नमस्कार दर्शक मित्रों। आज के थिंक लाइन के नए संस्करण में आपका फिर से स्वागत है। जैसे आप देख रहे हैं हमारे साथ डॉक्टर आदित्यन जी मौजूद है। तो नेचुरली हम जियो पॉलिटिक्स की बात करने वाले हैं। और ये भी एक ऐसे जियो पॉलिटिक्स की जहां पर काफी लोगों को ये समझ में नहीं आता कि हकीकत में है क्या। क्योंकि हम लोगों ने जब जब भी इस देश का नाम सुना है तब हम किसी न किसी युद्ध के ताल्लुक से उसे जानते आए। वी हैव नोन दैट कंट्री in the late 70s with US aggression and this and that and all. It's a small country named Vietnam. मित्रों, वियतनाम की बात करें तो ये तीन ऐसे देश है पैसिफिक के अंदर। एशिया पैसिफिक लोग बोलते हैं, हम बोलते हैं इसे इंडो पैसिफिक। लेट मी क्लेरिफाई दैट। ये इंडो पैसिफिक में एक ऐसा देश है जिसको लाओस के कंबोडिया के साथ में मिला के यू विल बी सरप्राइज्ड दैट वॉट एवर बॉम्ब शेल्स, गोला बारूद जितना दूसरे विश्व युद्ध के अंदर नहीं यूज हुआ था उतना इन छोटे छोटे देशों के ऊपर अमेरिका ने यूज किया था। और ये वियतनाम की बात करेंगे हम। उसकी वजह है कि आजकल भारत का उसके साथ में दोस्ताना बन रहा। वियतनाम के प्राइम मिनिस्टर, वह एक ही बार मैं नाम प्रोनाउंस करूंगा, शायद मैं गलत हूं इसीलिए एक ही बार बोलूंगा, एम मिन चिन। वो 3 दिन की भारत यात्रा पर थे अपने पूरे डेलीगेशन को लेके। और बहुत से करार दोनों देशों के बीच में हुए। अभी आप सोचोगे कि वियतनाम की बात क्यों करनी। डॉक्टर आदित्य जी हमें बराबर समझाएंगे। मैं नटशेल में इतना बता दूं कि वियतनाम से हमारे जो सौदे होंगे उससे किसी को पेट के अंदर बहुत गुड़गुड़ी हो रही है और होने जा रही है। और उसका नाम है चाइना, जो ड्रैगन, एलिफेंट इन द रूम एज वी से। ये सब है क्या, उनके साथ में क्या क्या हुआ। और जो जॉइंट स्टेटमेंट आया वो बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट था। हमारे प्रधानमंत्री ने बहुत कुछ तो नहीं कहा मगर जितना कहा उतना, वी आर ऑल अगेंस्ट एक्सपांशनिज्म। विस्तारवादी देशों के सामने हम खड़े। ये जो शब्द है ना एक्सपांशनिज्म, उसका बहुत बड़ा मायना है। तो ये क्या हो रहा है इसकी हम बात करेंगे। डॉक्टर अदित्यन जी हमें समझाएंगे। इंडो पैसिफिक जिसे हम कहते हैं, लोग कहते हैं एशिया पैसिफिक, चाइना वांट्स टू कॉल इट एशिया पैसिफिक बिकॉज दे थिंक ये इनका ही जा रहा है। मगर क्या ऐसा है। साथ में हमें ये भी समझाएंगे वो कि अदानी का इतना बड़ा इन्वेस्टमेंट वियतनाम में क्यों होने जा रहा है। मेकोंग गंगा कॉरपोरेशन क्या है। ये सब बातें आज होगी। और उसके साथ में अंतिम 10-15 मिनट के अंदर हम बात करेंगे 24 अगस्त को। 24 अगस्त दिन याद रखिएगा। 24 अगस्त को हमारे प्रधानमंत्री यूक्रेन जा रहे हैं जेलेंस्की से मिलने। ऐसा कहा जाता है कि वहां पर कुछ शांति वार्ता हो। ऐसा भी माना जा रहा है कि पहले G7, फिर मॉस्को, फिर ऑस्ट्रिया और अब कीव। वेल, ही इज गोइंग टू ब्रिंग अबाउट पीस। व्हाट डज डॉक्टर जी थिंक्स, इसकी भी बात करें। आदित्य जी आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। 10-12 दिन के बाद हम शुरू कर रहे हैं फिर से। और ये वियतनाम का सब्जेक्ट आज लिया मैंने, उसकी वजह सिर्फ ये है, आपने भी सजेस्ट किया मुझे कि इन देशों के बीच में एक बड़ा सांस्कृतिक, कल्चरल और सिविलाइजेशनल टाइज है भारत और उनके बीच में। इसका पौराणिक नाम जामुदीवा था। वह कंबोडिया में हम जानते हैं अंकोर वाट है। वियतनाम में भी काफी ऐसे मंदिर हैं जहां पर शिव की, पार्वती की प्रतिमाएं आपको मिलेंगी। तो उस लिहाज से भी ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। और भारत अपना सॉफ्ट पावर मसल दुनिया भर में स्प्रेड करता है। इन सब के क्या महीने हैं? व्हाट डज इट थिंक, व्हाट डज इट मीन, दिस 3 डे विजिट? हाँ, दोनों ने कहा है कि हम 15 बिलियन का ट्रेड जो है उसे बढ़ा के 3 गुना करना चाहते हैं। वेदर इट विल हैपन? व्हाई इज अदानी सो हेविली इन्वेस्टिंग इन दिस इंडो पैसिफिक? इन सब की तह तक जाएंगे आज। डॉक्टर आदित्य जी, आपका स्वागत है। द फ्लोर इज योर्स।
धन्यवाद हिमांशु जी, फिर से मुझे चर्चा का अवसर देने के लिए। ये महत्वपूर्ण विषय है। वियतनाम जिस राष्ट्र को हम कहते हैं, ये साउथ ईस्ट एशिया में है। उसका पुराना नाम उस रीजन का, उस क्षेत्र का था इंडो चाइना। Immediately after Second World War, this region used to be called Indo-China. So just for your viewers, what is the meaning of Vietnam? In the Vietnamese language, actually, it just means northern people. The historical name of the southern part of this country was Champa. And Champa was a Hindu kingdom. So the so-called South Vietnam prior to unification of Vietnam was essentially the Champa kingdom.
Yes.
So it is my contention that the so-called South China Sea should always be called South Champa Sea. Because that is the EEZ of Vietnam. China is far up in the north. Vietnam is there as the immediate littoral state. So we need to change the narrative there. But this visit is important because after the destruction of the country of Vietnam, carpet bombing, Agent Orange, United States lost the war in Vietnam and had to evacuate very badly. But the newly emerged unified Vietnam was very pragmatic. They were attacked by China in 1979. Yet they are engaging with everyone, including United States and China. So let's talk in terms of trade. India-Vietnam trade is $14.8 billion. It has grown 2.5-fold from 2016 when Prime Minister Modi visited there. But Vietnam-China trade is $171.2 billion. Vietnam-US trade is $125 billion. So even if we triple $15 billion, the 3 times or 5 times would be $75 billion. It's nowhere in the league. And this is an area that we have been lagging. We always talk about the civilizational ties, the cultural ties, soft power, which is important, but that's not the only thing in today's geopolitics.
Yes.
So my hope is that besides the civilizational issues, we deal with hardcore economic issues, increase bilateral trade, and increase bilateral investments. Vietnam, being a poor country, probably will not be able to invest in Bharat, but Bharat can invest in Vietnam, just like other countries are doing. So I won't name a particular name, but all the Indian entrepreneurs would be very welcome in Vietnam, whatever sector they want to invest in. Vietnam is very flexible, and just like India, maintains strategic autonomy. So they have comprehensive strategic partnership with China that was signed in 2008. They signed comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia in 2012, and they signed comprehensive strategic partnership with India in 2016. So their foreign policy is omnidirectional. Just like India, they are willing to talk, willing to sit with anyone, even their oppressors or attackers, colonial powers, both China and US included. So they are very pragmatic people, they are very hardworking people, they are very polite people. Besides economics and trade, India has a role to play in defense production and export of defense items. And that is very, very important. So this time in the visit of Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, India gave a line of credit of $300 million. In 2016, when Prime Minister Modi visited Vietnam, Vietnam was given a credit line of credit of $500 million. We have our own resource constraints, so we cannot be as liberal in investments and grants as China is. But at least our private sector can invest there. So that would be important. We are having defense cooperation with Vietnam. There are bilateral seaport visits, things like that. In June of 2023, India gifted INS Kirpan, a fully operational Kukri class missile corvette. So people will say, why gift it? Why are you giving it free? Because it had already served 32 years in Indian Navy. It was fully operational, but I think this is, military diplomacy. Because around the same time when we gifted it to Vietnam, we also supplied 12 speedboats under a line of credit of $100 million. So we should be able to possibly, hopefully export BrahMos missiles to Vietnam.
That's what I was coming to. They are in talks of that.
Yeah.
And it is even said in some quarters that maybe a couple of BrahMos missiles will be given as a gift first. And then
Well, that's a way of engaging. That's a way of confidence building measures. Also, India can export Akash surface-to-air missiles to to Vietnam. Possible Tejas Mk2 if we can increase the production. And basically in shipbuilding, they can be joint production. We are already doing oil exploration in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. And time and again, it was obstructed by China. The PLA Navy almost a decade ago stopped Indian, oil explorers. It's ONGC Videsh that has been given the contracts, and this has been going on since 1988. So as India implemented its look east policy into act east policy, I think this needs a transformation to be the east policy. That is my humble submission to policy planners. That we just don't act east, we be the east. And there's a very subtle difference, but very significant difference in act east versus be the east. We have to take the ownership, the leadership of the region as we had done historically. Mekong-Ganga project, Mekong-Ganga cooperation, although started 20 years ago, is not so live and thriving as I would like it to be. It's a 6-country cooperation, regional cooperation. And what it does that it eliminates some of the naysayers. And I'm not going to name those countries, but since these 6 countries are on the Asian landmass, some of those obstructionist countries that are in ASEAN and take generally anti-India view are no longer not in this cooperation. So it should be a good vehicle for regional engagement by India. Unfortunately, it has not got the bandwidth it requires. So that should be our effort. But we may not talk in detail about defense cooperation and defense exports, but it is the basic economic relationship, mercantile relationship that we need to develop. Vietnam is very enterprising nation. As West is doing de-risking and decoupling from Chinese economy, a lot of Western companies have relocated to Vietnam, and they found Vietnam more hospitable than Bharat, so we lost out on that. But there is a scope for multilateral cooperation with Western countries and Japan for joint productions in Vietnam. So there will have to be avenues found by which we consolidate this relationship rather than just hark on the civilizational ties and cultural ties and all that.
But sir, there is one more thing which I want to draw your attention to. There is one logistical agreement also, wherein by which you can use each other's ports.
Yes, we
India
have.
using Vietnamese ports will be about what, 130 kilometers from mainland China?
Yes. That has been there. And that has been there because in 2016 we had comprehensive strategic partnership. So yes, having access to these ports, and again, without taking names, certain Indian business groups are developing ports wherever they can freely bid on that.
Airports. There are
Uh,
2 airports being developed.
yeah.
by
So there is no reason why we should feel diffident because that is not the government to government, that is private sector initiatives. Private sector's business is to run their business and grow their business. And if they are doing in foreign countries in Southeast Asia region or Mekong-Onga cooperation region, all the glory to them. All the glory to them. Mind you, we don't have a large Indian diaspora in Vietnam.
Yes, we don't.
We are trying to increase the bilateral tourism, trying to develop the Buddhist circuit here. But again, the bilateral exchange of tourists is not that high, like 32,000 Vietnamese visited India and maybe 160 or 159,000 Indians visited Vietnam. But people don't realize it's a beautiful country. People are very polite and they appreciate India. And you see all these ancient cultural relics, temples, all that kind of thing. And it's a very cheap country. It's
Yes.
a very cheap country for tourists, Indian tourists, if they go. They will find it very affordable, very hospitable. So there is no reason why we should not promote tourism at a larger scale because that will bring people to people exchanges.
Dr. Adityanjee, I would like to draw your attention as far as this friendship is concerned to one more sector. It was the Prime Minister who came out and said, it was during the COVID that India helped us so much with vaccinations. Now, this pharmaceuticals industry and the two-way trade, they have already invited some of the big Indian pharmaceuticals companies to come to Vietnam and co-produce that. So their needs of medicine is taken care of. Right now, the figure says it's about 33% of the total pharmaceuticals which are being supplied by India, by Bhatt. Now they say that needs to be increased to 60-70%. And that could be done by this, people setting up that partnerships in Vietnam and coming up with that. Now that
So
way, there are so many other sectors which they have proposed. There have been 7 agreements signed here.
there are multiple sectors in which we can jointly benefit each other's economies, because $15 billion in today's terms is hardly anything.
Nothing.
So we have to realize that we have underperformed, and whether it is agriculture, whether it is pharmaceuticals, whether it is electronics, whether it is, vaccine production, whether it is tourism, uh, we can promote medical tourism from Vietnam, that we are very strong at. Most of them go to Thailand.
Right.
It can be a second venue. We can provide technical education, not just on government to government basis, but Vietnamese student can be allowed to study in India. That actually is much beneficial to us rather than having students from Middle Eastern countries come to Bharat. Because there are advantages of building, at least from my perspective, cultural linkages with the countries with whom we had historical ties. So sky is the limit, because this is a country that is very welcoming. If they can invite Americans and Chinese, both countries that have attacked Vietnam, and they are being very, very pragmatic in that sense. Yes, they understand the strategic threats from China, but because of the contiguity, because of China being an economic giant, they have $171.2 billion bilateral trade with China. And India needs to get a pie of that.
दर्शक मित्रों, एक चीज मैं आपको बता दूं कि आज की स्थिति में, in today's world, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies. Now, Vietnam, despite being bombed very, very, very heavily, even much more than Second World War, both sides, if you take together, still more bombs were thrown on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia by American troops. Now, in such a scenario also, and they have been fighting bitterly with Chinese on one side. Now, in all these things, the next question is going to be very, very important. What is the strategic significance of this visit? And mind you, overtures or the gestures of both the leaders of, hugging 7 times in front of the camera. Who is going to be happy?
So the bottom line is that Vietnam is one country with which we don't have any irritants in bilateral relationship. No irritants whatsoever. We have problems even with our relationship with Japan. We have problems with our relationship with Russia. But with Vietnam, we do not have anything whatsoever, any irritant. So our interests mutually converge very harmoniously. Both countries are exercising and implementing strategic independence, and we are willing to talk to anyone on the world stage, in terms of building up relationships. Slight difference is that we cannot have normal relationships with Pakistan. That is for good. But they are having good relationships with China in the economic realm. Of course, we also have good relations in terms of trade with China. China is usually the first or second largest trading partner of India, but we have a lot more, historical baggage because of Chinese expansionism, and Vietnam is also facing that. So that is where our mutual interests converge. Strategic partnership is going to grow. It's not going to end there, and we need to continue to buttress it. We need to provide them. By means of providing, I mean we need to do export. Yes, there can be some gifts here and there as, free goodies just to build up some confidence building measures. But ultimately, the economic relationship, the trade relationship needs to expand, because without that, military relationship alone is not able to sustain on a long-term basis. And this is a country that welcomes, investment by anyone. not just Adani or Ambani, other, entrepreneurs. Maybe the FICCI should take a trade delegation every year to Vietnam.
In fact, when you said FICCI had a meeting with the Vietnamese delegation on the first day of their arrival, and there are reports that they were sitting with Chandrababu Naidu. In Andhra Pradesh, there's going to be some joint venture of EVs, which is going to come up with Vietnamese partnership. Now that is also happening. Yes, sir.
So that reminds me of an old story that once a foreign minister of Vietnam visited MEA in Delhi, and he asked one of the IFS officers that he wanted to visit Raigad. And the question was asked, why Raigad? Because of Chhatrapati Shivaji, because they owed their strategic education to Chhatrapati Shivaji's tactics, and that was arranged by the Ministry of External Affairs. So our own diplomats were totally unaware.
Of
But
what?
they said, so that story comes in my. I'm just bringing it to tell your viewers that Vietnamese people, Vietnamese government hold India in very good regard, in very high esteem. So time is right to consolidate this relationship. Talk and rhetoric alone is not sufficient. We have to do it. We have to,
Walk the
capture
talk.
markets. Capture the markets. You have already captured the hearts. And the path will be very easy. So wherever Indian entrepreneurs get an opportunity, field is wide open.
दर्शक मित्रों, ये आपको लगता होगा कि इतनी बातें क्यों कर रहे हैं हम वियतनाम के बारे में, बट इफ यू सी द मैप्स, आप अगर नक्शा देखोगे, द पोजीशन ऑफ वियतनाम, काफी लोग थाईलैंड को बैंकॉक को जानते हैं, थाईलैंड, बैंकॉक, कंबोडिया और उसके बाद वियतनाम, और वियतनाम का एक बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा चाइना से जुड़ा हुआ, वहां दरिया है, पैसिफिक, एंड ये जो है ना, उसके नीचे की तरफ आपको मलाका चौक मिलेगा. We have been talking so much about South China Sea, ye, wo, where India can tackle Chinese growing influence. We have been talking about Malacca Chowk. When you look at all these things and you look at the geographical position, it's something like, as we cannot avoid Pakistan because it is just our neighbor. Similarly, if you are looking at growing your influence economically, you cannot look through this region. Look, ahead, up before maintaining your foothold in this region. The reason is, आज भी 60% trade वहां से हो रहा है. So, sir, that way, if you look at it, who is going to be worried by this?
So as I said that we have to change the narrative. I don't like the term South China Sea because it is South Champa Sea.
South Champa Sea. Okay.
And we have to have our access to South Champa Sea. We have to have freedom of navigation, freedom of naval operations there. Because yes, 60% of the world trade comes there. Those are the sea lanes of communication. So it is very, very important. And that's why India and Vietnam are working together. Now, people may feel that we are ganging up against one particular country, but you have friendly relations between Vietnam and Bharat, so be it. Nobody is stopping other countries to have friendly relations with Vietnam, but India should do her utmost to consolidate this relationship, not just in strategic sense, but also in all dimensions. That is what I'm trying to say. It should not be left to just one dimension. Historically, we have talked about our civilizational ties. Yes, soft power is fine, but this is the era of economic diplomacy. Without economy, nothing happens. So we come back to the issue of bilateral trade, which is mere a pittance, $15 billion annually. This needs to change. And it can change.
Mind you, दोस्तों, I'll not be surprised if this 15 million triples in few years time. अगले 3 से 5 साल में अगर ये 50 मिलियन को क्रॉस कर जाए, स्टिल इट विल नॉट बी इनफ, बिकॉज आजकल विश्व देख रहा है चाइना +1 की पॉलिसी. भारत भी देखेगा. अभी उस +1 के अंदर भारत में जो हिस्सा आ रहा है उसके मुकाबले you'll be surprised when you see the size of Vietnam, when you see the size of India. Vietnam is hogging more. That's because they are a very labor intensive country.
Not only they are labor intensive, again, the issue comes of system. It's a communist country. So they don't have a noisy democracy like we have. Whatever Communist Party decides happens. And in Bharat, there are multiple poles of powers, every branch of the governance, whether it is judiciary, whether it is opposition, whether it is executive, whether it is legislative branch. Anyone wants to put an objection to any commercial activity. So we are in this unique status of paralysis, secondary to too much of democracy, where every decision is questioned, and that delays things.
दर्शक मित्रों, ये जो कह रहे हैं ना, इसका सीधा भावार्थ मैं बता दूं आपको स्पष्ट हिंदी के अंदर. हमारे भारत में क्या होता है, भले वियतनाम का स्पेलिंग लिखने नहीं आता हो, कोई बात नहीं, मगर हम विरोध करेंगे क्योंकि सरकार ने उनके साथ द्विपक्षीय संबंध की बात. और यही बात हर जगह पे आज हो रही है. लोगों को खाली विरोध करना, समझना नहीं है. और साथ में क्योंकि एक्स कंपनी वहां जाके इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रही है, प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रही है, तो उसको घसीटने के लिए वियतनाम के साथ में संबंध बिगाड़ेगा. ये भारतीय डेमोक्रेसी है. ये वाइब्रेंट डेमोक्रेसी के जो नफा नुकसान की जब हम बात करते हैं ना अकाउंट्स में, तो ये नुकसान के ओर रखना पड़ेगा. और यही तकलीफ हमें आ रही है, यही डॉक्टर आदित्य जी बता रहे. वेल, वी होप कि ये 15 बिलियन का ट्रेड बढ़ के 50+ तो हो ही जाएगा, हो ही जाना चाहिए अगले 4 सालों में, 3-4 सालों में. अब हम जाएंगे दूसरे टॉपिक की ओर कि जिसकी तरफ पूरे विश्व का ध्यान अभी है आजकल. सर, व्हाट इज दिस हैपनिंग? Everybody was saying, India should not play a role, Modi should, but then he goes to G7 after the elections, has a word with Zelensky, then goes to Russia, sits in the golf cart of Vladimir Putin, next day flies to Austria, comes back, Ukrainian foreign minister again says something. He decides on a trip to Ukraine on their national day on 24th of August. The grapevine is right, sir. बातें बहुत हो रही है कि India will be the mediator, because if Russia will listen to anyone, it will be Narendra Modi. That's what people say. क्योंकि the attempt made by the Western powers in Europe to bring about peace without Russia did not materialize. Sir, ये हो क्या रहा है?
I think this is a very complex move on the chessboard. And we should not actually take hasty impressions or hasty conclusions. We have very good relationships with Russia, and just now I said that despite those good relations, there were some issues with Russia also. With Ukraine, our relationship has not been that great. Everybody knows that. Ukraine voted in United Nations against India in 1998 when we went nuclear, overtly nuclear. Ukraine has been sending selling arms to Pakistan for a long period of time, tanks, some aircraft engines and other things, other arms. Ukraine sold an unfinished Varya class aircraft carrier to China in 1999, which is China's first aircraft carrier Lionic, 65,000 ton displacement. Ukraine has criticized India on human rights issues and number of issues. So our relationship with Ukraine is not all that great. We had students in Ukraine, how the students were treated immediately after the breakout of the war. They were not treated very rightly. In fact, the prime minister had to call Zelensky and Putin to, withhold bombing to allow Indian students to evacuate and all that sort of thing. Ukraine made very hostile statements saying that India is biased towards Russia and all that sort of thing. That's all there. There is pressure on India from United States also to cut ties or to take the right approach towards Russia, which is not happening. And they realize that India's relationship with Russia is not at the expense of US, and the other way around, that in order to placate the United States, India is not going to stop relation. They understand that now. But their expectation is that we do engage with Ukraine also. In fact, not Anthony Blinken, but their national security, Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific coordinator, basically made a statement about India's need to engage with Ukraine. So efforts are made that India is engaged in the process. And that is important for India also. Because in this conflict, it's essentially a tribal European conflict. We have no skin in the game, either for Russians or for Ukrainians. I personally feel that Putin made a mistake. He got himself saddled into a quagmire from which it's difficult to escape. Whatever his rationale for attacking Ukraine was, to a certain extent, you understand why that was important for him, but he did not do adequate preparation, so he got stuck there. So India has no skin in the game. And there's no reason for India, considering our strategic independence policy, to just engage with Russia and leave Ukraine. Why? Ukraine is still a large country. It's one of the biggest exporters of wheat in the world. It has large land mass. Maybe a time may come, we may have to lease land from Ukraine for food production. That totally destroyed Ukrainian economy after the war will need to be rebuilt. And if we do not have links there, if we don't engage that country now, not only government to government, but also Indian business will suffer because they will be, unilateral, multilateral investment through United Nations, pledges will be made through World Bank, IMF, for investment in Ukraine. And who will take benefit of that? Western countries, Western companies. And India needs to, prepare herself for sharing that part of the economic pie. Whether India will be a mediator or interlocutor, that is the difference. I personally will say that India should not get into the mode of being a mediator. It sounds nice, but Western countries are laying a trap for you. By saying that you have good relations with both, so you'd be the mediator. Because the war is not going to stop because of India's mediation. War is going to stop when NATO stops
Right. Supplying weapons to you.
supplying weapons to Ukraine. This war could have stopped in April of 2022, 2 months after the war started. But NATO and specifically Britain decided. Boris Johnson went to Ukraine and told Zelensky not to accept ceasefire. So India should not waste her efforts in trying to be a mediator. India can be interlocutor. So you talk to both sides, but India does not
Let them
hold.
talk themselves, yes. Prepare a mutual ground, make both of them come to a common place, and then talk to them. Talk.
Yeah. But we
Yes.
need to have our independent engagement despite Ukraine's hostile overtures and hostile statements and anti India rhetoric on international platforms in the past. Uh, it is pragmatic to continue to engage with them for future, you know, sharing of
The pie.
the economic pie. We just talked about Vietnam. So you have to be pragmatic. There are no permanent enemies. If you are going to get benefit from some engagement, you need to get that. If Indian companies have, you know, opportunity to rebuild their cities, their platforms, their airports, their, electric grid, why do we want to deprive them of that possibility of getting piece of business?
Then it is said in the Western media, I was just reading somewhere, that 50% of the rebuilding of Ukraine contracts will go to the companies like Vanguard and BlackRock and whatnot.
Yeah.
And 50% Russia will take. Now, this reconstruction business is something like a war business. USA's war machine, fuels their economy. Similarly, the reconstruction business also fuels the US economy.
Of course, because they get all the contracts. So
And it's
again,
one after another that they keep on repeating the cycle. Now, in such a scenario, will Modi be able to at least bring about a ceasefire? Do you think so?
well, again, I'm sticking to my original point. It is very pragmatic for India to continue to engage, but don't assume the role of mediator. You don't have the wherewithals because there are two superpowers, or let me put it, say, Russia on one side, NATO alliance on the other side. You may have some good words of advice to Russia, but you do not have any control over NATO alliance, which is a military alliance. And it has its own agenda, which is an imperialistic agenda. So why get sucked into a situation when you cannot control the outcome?
दर्शक मित्रों, बहुत स्पष्ट रूप से आपने सुना. Very clearly he said we should not get into that, but it's happening. Something has happened. And that's for sure after the Moscow visit and then the Austria's visit.
It's important to keep talking. It's important to continue to guard and preserve Indian interests in both the countries. You are not going to sacrifice relationship with Ukraine on the altar of friendship with Russia, and you are not going to, sacrifice our relationship with Russia on the altar of India-US relationship. So we have to talk to both. And yes, war has become a quagmire, but after a while, United States came out of Afghanistan after 20 years. So they will come out of Ukraine after some time when their, arms supplies
दर्शक
or
मित्रों, ये इतिहास की हकीकत बता रहे हैं डॉक्टर साहब. देखिए, अफगानिस्तान में इतने सालों रहने के बाद सोवियत भी चले गए. उसके बाद अमेरिकन आए, वो भी चले गए. अमेरिकन गल्फ में जाके भी यही किया, सद्दाम के देश में. आज भी थोड़ी बहुत प्रेजेंस है, मगर वहां पे क्या सिचुएशन है वो आप देख रहे हैं. इतिहास फिर से रिपीट होने जा रहा है. और अगर इसमें मध्यस्थी नहीं, इंटरलोक्यूटर की तरह अगर भारत काम कर सकता है, तो उसका श्रेय उसको मिलेगा। दोनों को बुलाओ, दोनों को साथ में बैठाओ और फिर उनको अपनी बातें करनी। हम कहीं बीच में नहीं जाए, और ये बात आपको समझनी पड़ेगी। तो अभी जो काफी मीडिया ने एक हाइप बना के रखा है कि 24 को मोदी जी जाएंगे, ऐसे जेलेंस्की को बात करेंगे, ऐसे जेलेंस्की को बोलेंगे और 25 से सीज फायर हो जाएगा, ऐसा कुछ नहीं होने वाला। मित्रों, बड़े स्पष्ट रूप से समझ लीजिए, यूएस इलेक्शंस होंगे। यूएस इलेक्शन में एक कैंडिडेट डोनाल्ड ट्रंप ने तो बहुत स्पष्ट रूप से बता दिया है कि मैं आऊंगा, ये वॉर बंद हो जाएगी, बिकॉज आई स्टॉप फंडिंग देम। तो उससे पहले अगर कुछ होता है तो दुनिया का नसीब, कम से कम एक ही चीज हो सकती है, और वो है प्रैग्मेटिकली, जैसे डॉक्टर अदिति ने बताया, मैं वही सोच रहा हूं, कम से कम सीज फायर हो जाए। कम से कम जो भी लोग आजकल मर रहे हैं वो मरना बंद हो जाए। और फिर आएगी ईरान और इसराइल की बात। वहां भी काफी लोग आपको फंसाने की कोशिश करेंगे कि भारत को मध्यस्थी करनी चाहिए, दोनों से जमती है, मगर हमारी तो दुनिया में सबसे जमती है, एक दो देशों के ऊपर। तो अब हमें समझना है स्ट्रेटेजी को, किससे क्या कर। अभी जी, वन लास्ट वर्ड अबाउट दिस यूक्रेन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, यूक्रेन रशिया कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, एंड व्हाट डू यू फोरसी सिटिंग इन यूएस? इज यूएस रेडी टू स्टॉप द वॉर?
I think the political situation in United States is very fluid. It is as fluid as it can be, from what the race was, what the election was, what is now, and you don't know what will happen next week. Usually, I don't like to discuss party politics. You don't know who will be chosen as the vice presidential running mate of Kamala Devi, Gopalan Harris.
कमेला दे ली, कमला नहीं सर, वो तो अपने आप को अफ्रीकन बोल दी थी।
Uh, नाम तो कमला देवी ही है ना, लीगल नाम. There is some talk about Donald Trump dropping his vice president presidential running mate. There's a lot of concern in Republican Party as to what Trump is posturing, not only about Ukraine but about NATO also. So situation is very fluid here. It's only on January 21st, when transfer of power happens from Biden administration to the next administration, whatever that is, and we cannot make any prediction because situation changes by the day. I think that is when there will be clear thinking. Uh, till that time, any half-hearted measure will not be helpful. Already mistakes have been committed. Issue is the tolerance of the US taxpayers, how long they will continue to fund this war. That will be decided after the elections are over and the new administration takes place, because right now, 5-6 months, nobody is going to do anything major.
तो दर्शक मित्रों, जैसे सुन लिया आपने, इट्स गोइंग टू बी अ chaotic world for another coming 5-6 months, because US is somewhere down the line involved in both the wars that is, and I'll not be surprised if one another small theater is opened. मित्रों, आज के लिए तो इतना ही, मगर जाने से पहले मैं आपको कह दूं, प्लीज लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब अवर वीडियोस। हमारे चैनल को भी सब्सक्राइब कीजिए, और जितना हो सके उतना सपोर्ट कीजिए। डिस्क्रिप्शन के अंदर आपको, अगर आप सपोर्ट करना चाहते हैं तो सभी चीजें मिल जाएगी। आज ये कन्वर्सेशन यहीं पर बंद करेंगे, मगर एक चीज का ध्यान रखिए कि मित्रों, कभी कभी भी कोई बात सुनने के बाद उछल कूद ज्यादा मत कीजिए, उसको समझने की कोशिश कीजिए। आप समझेंगे नहीं तो सही बात जान ली। और इसी के लिए कहा जाता है कि हमें मध्यस्थी नहीं करनी चाहिए। हाँ, बस ठीक है, हम दोनों को इकट्ठा करके बिठा देंगे, बात करो। मगर हम ऐसा नहीं कहेंगे, तुम्हारी तरफ से मैं, आपकी तरफ से भी मैं, आओ बैठो, मैं दोनों के हाथ मिला दूंगा। ये हो नहीं पाएगा, आज के विश्व में ये हो नहीं पाएगा। डॉक्टर आदित्यन जी, वन लास्ट वर्ड फॉर अ मिनट एंड देन विल रैप दिस वन।
I think India's policy planners should always remember the IPKF episode in Sri Lanka. How a naive young prime minister was seduced into interfering in domestic affairs of a country, sent our forces with disastrous consequences. So one should always remember that episode, that temporary popularity or temporary, accolades may not be in nation's long-term interests.
मित्रों, स्पष्ट रूप से बात सुन ली आपने। मैं जाते जाते एक बात याद दिला दूं, IPKF भेजा था हमने लंका में। वेल, ज्यादा कुछ नहीं करें। किसी में इंटरफियर करना आज की दुनिया में खतरनाक हो सकता है। किसी भी राष्ट्र की अपने हिस्सों, अपनी बातों में इंटरफियर करना खतरनाक हो सकता है। मित्रों, आज के लिए इतना ही, मगर ये चीज पाकिस्तान को नहीं लागू होती है, जाने से पहले इतना कह दूं। वहां तो अननोन गनमैन जाएंगे। मित्रों, नमस्कार, जय हिंद,
Namaste.
जय भारत। थैंक
Namaste.
यू सर। थैंक यू सर।
Okay.